Hello, and welcome to this series of videos about programming, of all things. In real life, I am a software developer, and I thought that this would be a fun thing to do in my spare time. And it's really serving three purposes here. One is for people who don't really know much about programming, who might be interested in it, to get sort of a brief glance into what this sort of thing is like in terms of developing software. I'm going to be explaining some of the more specific terms that I'm using for those lay people who may be watching, briefly and simply. Two, it could be of interest to people who do code somewhat or are learning to code and want to look at what a finished product goes through from start to finish. And three, it's for myself, to keep myself on track, because otherwise I will get bored and not code anymore, and that seems like a lose-lose situation. So, let's get into what I'm actually going to be doing. The software that I want to create here is a calendar application, and you might think, hey, there are already tons of calendar applications, and that's true. But there are specific features that I look for in calendar applications, and I don't like shopping around and downloading a bunch of things to see if they have everything I want. And also, it's just fun to build things myself. So that's what I'll be doing here. There's a few key features I'm looking for that are distinct from what, say, Google Calendar might have to offer. The first is broader repeat options, and this is sort of what spawned this whole thing for me, is that I realized that I didn't know how to say something like repeat on the first Monday of every month. And that seems like a strange feature to not exist, since there are multiple holidays that are scheduled on the first Monday or second Tuesday or what have you of each month. The other thing that I would look for in this application is a very intuitive graphical user interface, or GUI, specifically with very smooth scope transitions. One of the things I notice when I'm using Google Calendar is that when I switch from monthly view to weekly view or to daily view, I often lose track of my place of where I am in time. So I want to fix that. The intuitive GUI will also play into other features, such as the ability to lock or unlock an event from a series. If, say, a weekly event happens to move to a different location or a different time, I want to be able to very easily modify that particular event without modifying the entire chain. I want there to be intuitive search functions, such that one can search by event name or description or time or so forth. And lastly, I want an accessible backend. That means that I want the actual data stored in the calendar to be easily accessible to not just the main program itself, but also other programs that I might use. And the one that comes to mind specifically for me is that I also run a Discord bot, and it would be cool if the Discord bot could access that and remind me of events in an integrated and consistent way. So for that, I'm going to be using fairly accessible data on the backend in the form of JSON encoding, meaning JavaScript object notation. This is a very straightforward and readable encoding method for coding defined objects such that they can be read by a program unambiguously. And the benefit of JSON, for me at least, is that it has a lot of integration into many different programming languages in very straightforward and simple ways. So if I want to write small scripts that allow the Discord bot to access the calendar, I can do that with relative ease. So, now that you know what I want from my calendar application, I can talk a little bit about how I'm planning on getting there. My game plan at this point is broken down into 5 parts of increasing difficulty as I go on. First, I want a very brief session of branding, just because in order to name and thumbnail these videos, it's good to have something to actually put on them. Normally I would do this much later in the process. Second, I want to have a schema description, and what that means is it's the precise way in which JSON will encode the calendar information. So this includes figuring out exactly what information the calendar can store and how it will be structured in the actual storage. After that, I'll be writing back-end scripts, which are small pieces of code meant to simply access and modify the data behind the calendar, as well as search through it to figure out what events are on what date, and so on and so forth. After that, I'll be looking into the long-term infrastructure, which is going to be how the code will be able to run over the long term. I expect this to be an application that will remain open for long periods of time, so I want it to be efficient in that regard. And lastly, I want some form of GUI, or graphical user interface, again, to be able to interact with the code easily with just a mouse. So that covers the basic game plan. From here, I already did some of the branding efforts, specifically for the name and logo. I went through several names. First one I could think of was Recal, which could be a reference to either recall, meaning to remember obviously, or recalendar, so a do-over of a calendar, in total being a kind of pun on a reconcepted calendar that lets you remember information, which is what calendars already do. The next name I thought of in Potentia is from the basis of calendar after looking it up on Wikipedia. Claire is actually fairly similar to the very, very old school word that eventually became calendar, so that seemed like a fun one. And then the two remaining ones were equinox, which is just sort of a generic word having to do with time. It does have a specific meaning, but not one that's really relevant here. And lastly, croissant, which you might think of as a bread roll, but obviously comes from a word meaning crescent, which relates to the moon, and our calendar is a lunar calendar, so I guess that's sort of a roundabout way of saying that it's about moons, or months, or whatever. Anyway, that's what I decided to go with. It's fairly snappy, memorable, and easy to draw a logo for. And now you know what the thing in the beginning was of me drawing croissants. And with that, I'll see you next time when we go over the schema description.